Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Tech Haberdashery here. I'm doing something a little bit different. I'm going to bring you some benchmarking performance. I through a little bit of serendipity and bad financial management on my part, I've kind of ended up with a GTX 960, which is my old graphics card, and I've got two GTX 1060s. One's a 3 gigabyte model, one's a 6 gigabyte model. I'll be sending the 3 gigabyte model back to where I got it from. Um, but since I thought I would had them all, I might as well do a little bit of benchmarking performance. I've got an Alienware 13 here, which is the first model that Alienware produced, which has the Alienware graphics amplifiers, the big box that you connect to it, and you put a full-size graphics card in. So I've never really had the opportunity to test it out with the different cards because I had a 960 when I got it. So it's let's see, about a year and a half, I guess, or maybe a little less than that. I've had my GTX 960. So I'm just going to show you some differences in the performance. I know that I promised the Leico phone that I was looking at, but I've had some issues getting that phone. Nobody seems to have it, or nobody's willing to ship it out of China. So, and just kind of, it's all kind of been up in the air with that. So, I'm going to do this instead. Hopefully, you find this more interesting, or somebody will find it interesting at least, and we'll get right to that. So, I'm going to start you out with some of the GTX 960 performance. This is a 2 gigabyte GTX 960, and I'm using the recommended settings for Gears of War 4. It's kind of the default settings for it, which is mostly medium level settings with a couple high effects thrown in here for fun. As you look at the screen, you'll notice that the VRAM usage is just about maxed out, and the GPU bind is at 100%. So it's completely using all of the RAM that is incapable of this graphics card here. It's also using all of its processing power. And if you notice, if you look around at a lot of the textures on the ground, especially the danger sign in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, you'll notice that things are very muddy. Now, this is not the medium settings. This is just the graphics card not being able to keep up with the demand of the game itself. So we've got it's quite a little bit of a disappointment, which is kind of what spawned me to get the 1060 in the first place. Now I'm going to pause it here for just a second so you can kind of see what's going on with the graphics performance. The average frame rate was 34 frames per second, which is not terrible. You can see that the CPU doesn't seem like it's really holding the system back too much. It can process a lot of frames, but you'll notice that it drops down to 12.4 frames per second a couple times. It's not anything that's particularly noticeable, especially if the average frame rate is 34 frames per second. But as you saw in the video with the muddy textures, it can get really bothersome, and it's not like a PC game, is it? I mean, if we want to have a better experience than the consoles, then we don't want to see muddy textures. Now I'm going to show you the GTX 1060 3 gigabyte version. As you'll notice here that there's not nearly as much, well, there's almost the same amount of video RAM usage, but not nearly as much of the actual GPU itself is bound in doing this, the processing of what you see on screen. This also is set to medium. It's the same settings that are on the 960 for the most part. And you'll notice on the ground that the textures are a little bit sharper. That's because there's extra video RAM to play with, and I think it just kind of speaks to NVIDIA's Pascal architecture and how much more efficient it is than the prior generation. Even here in this scene, you can look at the danger sign in the bottom right once again, and you can see that it's much more readable now. So just to kind of give us an idea of the difference between the two generations of cards and what even 1 gigabyte of additional video RAM can do for us. Alrighty, for the 1060, I didn't duplicate the settings setting by setting. I just threw it on medium so we could kind of get a rough idea of what's going on here. So with the 1060 3 gigabyte model, our average frame rate is right at 62 frames per second, and our average minimum is at 33 frames per second. So we're seeing over double the minimum frames per second from the 960. So just to kind of give you an idea of what the newer architecture and an additional 1 gig of video RAM can do for you. I'm not going to run through the whole video demo again, but just to give you an idea of what the default high settings look like on the 1060 3 gig model, you can see that the textures are much more crisp, and the GPU load is about the same. We're going to pause it here for a second and just take a look at the numbers. Average frame rate is 54 frames per second, and the average minimum is 27.5. So the high settings for the 1060 3 gig are getting us either 20 frames per second average better and a minimum average better frame rate of 15 frames per second. So a significant difference, even when the 1060 is using a higher fidelity. I'm going to briefly show you the 6 gigabyte 1060 on medium settings, just so you can kind of get an idea of the difference between the 3 gig and the 6 gig 1060. The particle effects, there's slightly more of them, it looks like, with the rocks at the beginning when they hit the ground than on the 3 gig 1060. There's definitely more of them than on the 960. And just to kind of show you what the differences are between the video RAM, which is to say not significant. We're looking at, you know, a 1-2 frames per second difference with maybe some fractional frames per second in between. And to close this out, I'm going to let you watch the full video playthrough of the 6 gigabyte 1060 recommended settings per Gears of War 4, what it thinks are the good, kind of the middle ground for what the game can do. So I'm just going to let this run all the way through, and I'll talk about the graphics performance here. We'll look at the screenshot at the end. Okay, so what do we see here? Well, it's not quite doing an average of 60 frames per second on these settings, but as you can see, it's also pushing Ultra. I noticed that the graphical frames per second ratings are not very different between the graphics cards, and I think that just comes down to a bit of a CPU bottleneck with my Alienware. I have the Alienware 13R1, which is the model that was released in the later part of 2014. I want to say it was December 2014, so we're coming up on it being right at 2 years old. So it's CPU wise, it's only a dual core i5. Its baseline is 1.7 gigahertz and it'll turbo clock up to 2.3 gigahertz. Not great, but all you really need for decent gaming is something with a fat memory bus, and this CPU has a fat memory bus, so it can, for the most part, push through the data. If you're looking at getting something similar to what I have, which is pretty mid-range as far as gaming laptops go, this is currently what Dell has on offer. For me personally, I would tell you to wait until the end of November. I saw a post on the Alienware Arena that said that is when the 13-inch models are going to have the 10 series graphics cards. So hopefully at that point, maybe I can consider upgrading as well. Mine cost me $1,000 2 years ago. So hopefully I can find something for about the same thing. Maybe get a quad-core CPU, because if you go and look at any of the gaming benchmarks out there, DirectX 12 has the ability to kind of dynamically use more CPUs than DirectX 11 did. So I'm hoping that will be something that's worth investing in, but we're going to see how DirectX 12 matures a little bit before I go that route. Alright kids, well that's it. Hopefully you found this enlightening and you found the information I provided useful. If you have got an older Alienware laptop, something that has the expansion slot on it, the little PCI connector, the PCI Express connector that they have for the graphics amp, and you're thinking about putting in a GTX 1060 or something in that family to kind of get an idea of what performance you're looking at, hopefully this kind of enlightens you to that. Or maybe if you have an older computer that has an older i5 or an i7 and you're kind of curious of what kind of bottlenecking you may experience one of these GPUs, hopefully that provided some information to you as well. But that's it. That's really all I got. Hopefully I can get back to reviewing phones. I don't know if that's going to be a thing in the immediate future, but this is something to tie you over at least. If there's any other interesting or cool stuff that comes around that I have an opportunity to dabble in, I will certainly make a video on it. Thanks guys, and have yourselves a great one. Bye now.